welcome to another episode of The Soul of Business with Blaine Bartlett. I am your host, Blaine Bartlett. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about the nature of, how to best put this? I'm just going to put it in terms of leadership and purpose. I mean, I'm just going to be very simple with this. My guest today, Dr. Roger Gerard, has written a book he's written a couple of books, but I was particularly struck by this one, Leading with Purpose, Reigniting Passion and Engagement for Professionals in Crisis. And this is something that is near and dear to my heart, because when we start taking a look at just kind of how organizations actually function, there's always some conversation around where's the breakdown. Okay. And in my experience, I mean, I've got 40 plus years in leadership development work, in all kinds of different aspects. But my early experience with large organizations was that literally just about every organization I ever encountered was toxic in some way to the human spirit. And there's reasons for that. And not the least of which is disconnection with purpose. There's a lot that we can be looking at through that lens of purpose. And Roger's got a very interesting take on this. We're going to be looking at some promises. Yeah, in the book, by the way, I'm going to just kind of salt this on the front end. We'll circle back on it on the back end. But in the book, he talks about 5 promises and 2 go-to-dos. And and it's a very specific prescription for making some things happen. So I'm going to just kind of use that as the launching pad as I welcome Roger Gerard, Dr. Roger Gerard here. 52-year history in leading executive and management development. He was a former chief learning officer at ThedaCare. Vice president actually of Northern Michigan Hospitals, and I've worked with some hospital systems in Wisconsin and Michigan both. And Roger, I just want to welcome you to the show. It's great having you here.
Blaine. Thank you. Let's get going. And what are you most interested in now that you've read my book?
Well, the idea of, generically, purpose, leading with purpose, as opposed to, because the way I define leadership, it's the process of influencing, takes command and control out of it, influencing with the intent of co-creating ownership transfers, coordinated movement. How do we do this dance as we enter unfamiliar territory? In pursuit of a worthy ideal, not a quarterly result, but a worthy ideal, something that's inspirational, not motivational. So influencing, which is presence, ownership transfer, co-creation, coordinated movement, the whole bundle of things within that part of it, and then the worthy ideal. So purpose kind of is the meta holder of all of those pieces for me. So I'm going to be very interested in kind of exploring this with you. And again, go back to the title of the show, the soul of business, which I think in large part for me has to do with purpose expressed. But I'm going to ask you a question here. When you hear the term the soul of business, what comes up for you? Yeah. And you've got a seminarian background. So I'm going to just kind of salt the mind with that here a little bit too.
Yeah, well, I love the context that you just said, Blaine. It serves me well in terms of understanding why I've written the books that I've written, and there are 3 out there right now: On the Mend, Owning the Room, and Lead with Purpose. I have a background of studying theology and philosophy and all of the things that historians have told us matter in our lives. And as part of that academic grounding, I have an appreciation for some of the conceptual stuff that happens between people and among people in different contexts and different organizations. In order to get at the question that you're asking, we have to use a couple of words that kind of betray our own biases about how we go through this stuff. Culture is one of those words. We talk about organizational culture as if we know what we're talking about, and most of us don't.
And most of us don't.
We talk about the business as being people coming together and aggregating for a common purpose. Well, that's a great idea, but frankly, it doesn't always work that way. We talk about organizations and businesses as having structure, and what we mean by that is something that's fairly hierarchical. That's not how people really interact with one another. It's a lie, it's a myth. And so if we start to get at some of these mistaken ideas, we can start to get at the real business of understanding what you call the soul of the business. I conceive of people coming together to get things done as community building activity. As a leadership consultant, management consultant, I have articulated my role as being one of bringing people together so that they can all meet their needs while meeting the needs of the business as well. Mm-hmm. And it's really hard to frame that without creating dualities. When you bring people together, they are the business. So to say we're bringing them together to feed the business, to meet that's kind of it's like a double negative. They are the business, and
they are the business.
Are we bringing people together to meet their common needs? So that's the beginning of trying to understand what we might mean by soul. I use that word soul in my writing, and I believe there is a common joining when we bring people together in connection, and it requires a leader who understands why people come to work. Unfortunately, most of what we consider business today is still operating under Taylor-esque rules. Mm-hmm. Frederick Taylor really sorted us out back in the early 1900s in talking about structure and talking about the beginnings of human motivation and measuring and managing work. And as he did all of that stuff, he set the stage during most of the 20th century for what we have today in the way of our understandings of how enterprise works. And there's a lot. There was a lot right with it during the evolution of business in the 20th century, but there were also a lot of gaps that took place in those understandings. And I think this last 2 decades are decades of trying to bring that together in a more uniform and more responsive way to the human needs in business. Mm-hmm. But we're also struggling with external forces, politics and paradigms that work against all of that. And so a lot of my work is trying to help leadership understand the ways they sabotage their own organizations, their own intentions as leaders.
Yeah, and most of them do in some way, shape, or form. They truly do.
I would say that differently. I would say most of us do.
Most of us do, yes. Hands in the air. There is no question about that. You raise an interesting point here. Why do people come to work? And it, for me, opens up a conversation around the distinction between motivation and inspiration. Beautiful. And motivation, in the way that I kind of coded in my mind here, has to do with external elements that are used to cause things to move. In the classic carrot and stick idea. Inspiration, I mean, literally, if we go to the root of the word, the breath is involved with this, and it's an internally driven process. It's an internally driven momentum that gets generated if I can tap into it as a leader. So in the work that you do, particularly when we're looking at leading with purpose, do you make a distinction between motivation and inspiration? And I cop to this. I didn't read detailed components of the book. I just kind of, in prepping for the interview, just kind of went through it. But that distinction between motivation, inspiration, and where does purpose come into play?
Yeah. I'm going to talk about a couple of things related to that. What you described as motivation, I describe as manipulation. Okay. Yeah. We have a lot of leaders who believe that it is their job to motivate people.
Yep.
Wrong. Again, this is left over from the residue of the 20th century. It is not anybody else's job to motivate me when I get up on Monday morning.
Thank
I
you.
motivate me. And if you want to call that inspiration, I'll call that inspiration. But what I'm talking about are people coming to their professions to do the work that they want to do because they want to do it. And I have the blessing of working with teachers, working with nurses, working with physicians, working with emergency rescue people. I've got a lot of healthcare background in addition to some manufacturing background. And I'm finding that people, they start their careers and their professions really wanting to do great work. And then something happens to them over a couple of years where some of that starts to go away. And it's because of our paradigm about what we can call motivation. It's because of how people are treated with theoretically incentives, the carrots to get certain things done that they might not otherwise want to do.
Yeah.
Once you start manipulating people, people start understanding that they're being manipulated. And nobody likes to be manipulated. And so you end up with a dynamic that works 100% against your intentions.
Mm-hmm.
When you feel like you're being manipulated, you will create resistance.
What's interesting about that is, there's some cliches that are bandied about quite frequently. People are our greatest asset. People are our greatest resource. And what I find fascinating by that is that embedded in both of those statements, assets on a balance sheet are depreciated over time. Resources are meant to be used. And so when we're talking about assets and resources, people have the experience that this is where manipulation comes into play here. They're being discounted over time, and they're being used until they're no longer usable, and then it's a replaceable component to this big machine.
In my next book, I'm going to have a chapter called People Lie. And there are a couple of lies that I'll talk about right now. We're all family here. No, you're not. Cut it out. That's nonsense. We're not family. Yep. I'm not your brother. I'm not your sister. We're not family. That's number one. Employees are our greatest asset. No, that's totally wrong. Otherwise, you would never lay one off.
Right.
The proof is what happens when you have a downturn. You don't throw away assets. That doesn't happen. So there are lies that occur in our everyday world. Oh, I want you to behave like you're an owner. Well, excuse me. Did you give stock? Are they really owners? Because if they're not, don't call them owners. You're lying to them. And what we have to understand is that people know they're being lied to. On some level, they know they are being lied to. And if we can get our arms around that fact, we're going to stop lying to them. It's all nonsense, and it works against our intentions of building community. It works against our intentions of bringing people together for common purpose.
I think one of the biggest lies that I've ever run into in business is that the purpose of business is to make a profit. And I absolutely believe that is a fundamental lie. Tip of the hat to Milton Friedman, but I think he got that completely wrong. The purpose of business is to enhance the experience of living on this planet. And if I'm doing that well, people will beat a path to my product or service because they get to feel uplifted as a consequence of association. The community gets to not only be built, but benefit as a consequence of that. And when I start looking at the way that organizations, and this is, if you look over my shoulder here, the right shoulder, compassionate capitalism. The whole thesis of that particular book, when I wrote that, was we behave compassionately when we feel as if we're connected to the consequences of our decisions.
Correct.
And compassion it's impossible to experience compassion unless I feel connection. And that's the behavioral analog to conscious business, conscious capitalism, is that willingness to act as if I am connected in a way that is fundamental and I'm concerned about your welfare.
Leadership is not going to be seen as connected if they think their job is to lead from the office suite.
Yep.
And that's where a lot of leaders live. They live in the executive suite. And frankly, that's failure ready to happen. I have worked with so many businesses where I've had to say to the executive leaders, get out of your offices, get out on the floor, and don't go there to solve problems. Go there to understand what people need.
Yep.
Period. Because if you don't understand what they need, you're never going to be able to lead them. You're never going to be able to help them.
Hi, I'd like to ask you to do something for me if you wouldn't mind. If you like this episode, I'd like you to not only subscribe on your favorite site, but I'd also like you to give a rating. Ideally, a 5-star rating would be greatly appreciated. But I think more importantly also would be just some comments. That helps with the algorithm and it helps build the audience with this. And more than anything else, if you could invite somebody else to listen, just share this episode with a friend, with a colleague. And I'd like to see how we can grow the soul of business. I think it makes a difference. Thanks. The idea, you mentioned healthcare, and I know you've spent a career in healthcare. Yeah, I'm on the teaching faculty of the American Association for Physician Leadership. And I've had the great opportunity for the last 20 years or so to work with hospital administrators, the C-suite, as well as with doctors directly. And the notion of rounding, and for those that aren't familiar with, this is where you do grand rounds. You do rounding. You just kind of get out in the hospital and see what the hell's going on.
Yeah.
And
even there, though, you'll find. I'm sure you've seen it in your own work. What a physician thinks rounding is, and what you and I might think rounding is for a leader might be two different things.
Very different. Yeah. And that's a conversation I have with the C-suite oftentimes is particularly if I've got a non-physician leader in position, it's kind of like, let's first of all get clear about what we're going to be talking about here, because it would be very incumbent on you to go out and, round, in your organization, but not in the same way your docs do.
No. The purpose of rounding in leadership is to learn.
Yep.
If you're going out there to solve problems, you don't get it.
Exactly.
You're going out there to learn. I spent, while I was within 2 different healthcare systems, I made it a policy of spending a day a month shadowing somebody, whether that be a nurse or a med tech or a physician or whatever, and with all of the safeguards for confidentiality and everything. But I made it my job to understand everything going on in each of the businesses. Not that I could become an expert at any of it. That wasn't the point.
No, that's not the point.
When somebody came to me and said, we have a resource need, or we have a crisis, or we have a significant issue that has to be attended to, I had at least some grounding in what they were talking about, and I could help.
Which, I'm going to kind of go, maybe not full circle, maybe 3/4 of a circle back here. What the idea of culture, comes into play with this, because if I'm rounding, as a leader, what I'm actually beginning to pay attention to are some of the cultural artifacts that can either enhance or inhibit what we're trying to make happen from a strategic perspective.
Yes.
Yeah. What's your, how, given the work that you do at Sloan Gerard, which is your consulting business, you do a lot of work with culture, leadership in culture in leadership. What's the greatest difficulty you have found, if there's a thematic thread here, that inhibits or is difficult? How do I want to frame this question? What's the greatest difficulty you've encountered when leaders are looking to actually deliberately shift a cultural bias within their organization?
One word: impatience.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have had often the experience of When I was within ThedaCare, you mentioned earlier, we brought in executives from the rest of the country and sometimes other parts of the world to witness what our weekly uh, improvement efforts were. Every week we had report outs from groups making their own improvements in their own daily work. And we were creating a bit of a reputation for this, referencing my first book on the mend, where we brought lean enterprise work into the organization.
Lean, yeah.
And as we did that, I very often met CEOs and other leaders in organizations who looked at what we did and said, gee, we're going to do that, but it's not going to take us 7 years. We're going to do it in 2. My whole response to that was, God bless you, good luck.
Yeah.
But it's not going to happen in 2 years. We've been at it for 12. And this stuff takes time.
Yeah.
You don't build trust in a day. You don't build understanding in a week. You don't build skills and knowledge in a month. And you don't build the technologies and infrastructure in 6 months. It takes time.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember there was a hospital system that we were brought into. They'd been fired. They had been fired by 2 consulting groups. Yeah. That specialized in the kind of work that we were going to be doing with
Yeah.
it. And the CEO asked me, literally, do you think you can do this? And I said, I think we can probably make this happen. And there was a big and that I landed here. It's going to take you far longer than you anticipate, and it's going to cost
Correct.
you far more than you thought you were budgeting for. If you're not willing to sign up for that, we're not going to work with you. And he swallowed hard, went to the board and said, give me permission.
I'll offer you a second major obstacle as well.
Please.
And this one is more nuanced, but it's real. Very often I get leaders coming to me saying, we want to make these big changes in the organization, and we want to earn their buy-in. And my reaction to that is, it's too late.
Yeah.
And they say, what are you talking about? Well, you've already decided the changes you're going to make. Are you willing to have your position influenced? Because if you're not willing to have your position influenced, you don't want buy-in, you want compliance. Those are 2 entirely different things. A lot of execs want to write me off right there.
Yep.
Okay. But I don't do manipulation work.
Exactly. See, that kind of goes to the part of the definition of my leadership model, influencing to co-create. Yeah. Co-creation involves, vulnerability. I've got to be willing to have my position challenged and be willing to move off of it if it doesn't hold water.
Yeah, you're using the word co-create in the same way I use the word co-authorship. It's got to be co-op.
Yeah.
And that's how you generate change, in which people are doing it because they want to. That's how it happens.
Yeah.
So
good. Question I've got here has to do in part with when people hear the term leading with purpose, and this has been around for a while, lead with purpose. Servant leadership comes into play. I mean, there's a number of different, memes that we could actually kind of tack up on the wall here. Leading with purpose, in my experience, when I'm actually working with leaders that are beginning to entertain the idea that this might have some viability to it, they real quickly, and I mentioned this just a moment ago, come into conflict in part with the idea of vulnerability. Because leading with purpose requires more about questions being positioned rather than directives being given. How do you square that in people's minds in the work that you do with your clients?
Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to ask what they're afraid of. I mean, clearly you see it as a vulnerability, and it's easy to recognize that through the questions they ask and the comments they make. And what they're afraid of are the people out there who are going to resist, the people out there who are going to challenge, the people out there who are going to just maybe leave because you're making all these changes. I've created in both of my last two books a bit of a framework, and actually I do an entire day on this with executives dealing with the cynics, apathetics, and naysayers out there. You can't get to purpose when you have contagious illness in the community. And I consider these three characters part of that contagious illness. The cynics are very untrusting people. They've been burned somewhere in their lives. They've been hurt. And because of that, they don't trust anybody. They certainly don't trust leadership. And they betray their cynicism through raw humor and undermining different decisions that are being made. The apathetics have given up. They've lost hope. They have a very different dynamic than the cynics, and they've just retired on the job. They will do the minimum necessary and no more. The naysayers are your strongest resistors, externally extroverted resistors, in the sense that they've got probably the last 5 or 10 or 15 years of creating the reality they have today, and they don't want it to change. Yeah. They want it to stay that they've got an investment in that reality. So for them to support the change is difficult. Leaders have to learn how to deal with this poison in the organization. And I'm clear it's poisonous. Because
that's where the toxicity comes in. Yeah.
If you can't change it, you got to remove it. Yeah. And so you spend some time helping these people understand. And with the cynics, you got to find out what burned them. You got to find out why they've been damaged, and is there a solution to that? Because if there's not, you got to help them be successful somewhere else. Yeah. The same thing is true with the apathetics. They've already retired on the job, and if you can't give them a reason to hope, they're done.
They're done.
And the naysayers are the easiest to deal with. They're motivated.
Yeah,
they're just motivated to keep things the way they are, and they have energy. And if you can take that energy and rechannel it and help them understand how it's in their best interest to bring out the change, they might become your best supporters over time.
Yeah. That's actually my experience is the ones that push back the hardest when they flip. They are the greatest advocates for what we're trying to make happen.
Absolutely.
And part of that has to do, I think, with my take on change is, it's almost never the change itself that people have a problem with. It's the disruption to existing relationships that the change causes. And not just the interpersonal relationships, but relationship with work process. We've done this for 30 years. Why should I change? I'm comfortable with this. Why should I change? Or, the naysayers, or the cynics more precisely here. This too shall pass. We've seen this before. All that stuff. The apathetics are, hey, I don't get paid to think.
I just wrote a blog post on LinkedIn I titled it, I am politically agnostic. And I want to underline that for what I'm about to say. We're in a master class right now in the States about how this works and what happens with resistance and what happens with the naysayers and the cynics and the apathetics. It's real, and it's going to be fascinating to see if leaders can get their arms around a healthy, constructive approach to dealing with all of this stuff. And some people are going to be damaged in the process.
Oh, very much so.
That's how it works. That's part of the reality, too.
Yeah, it is. Now, I want to be sure that we, come back, this, I will go full circle here. Start out with 5 promises and 2 go-to-dos.
Yeah.
This is something that you codify in your book. So as we kind of wrap things up here and put a bow on it, I want to give you a little bit of license to just kind of run with that for a while. And let's see where we end up.
Yeah, I'll try to be concise, but I want to start with where leadership makes the biggest mistakes. And then we can refer from that to the 5 promises and what leaders ought to do about that. Leaders fail to listen with respect. They typically listen in order to respond rather than in order to understand. And that's never a good place to be. listen with respect. You've hired professionals. You've hired people who you're training to do the work that needs to be done. You've hired people who you thought were competent. Listen to them with respect when they have something to tell you. Eliminate blame and shame from your vocabulary and your organization.
Yeah.
Too many leaders participate in the blame and shame game. The worst are those who blame their previous leaders. The blame and shame takes you nowhere but bad. It's not a good thing. And when you blame and shame others, you're sending a message that they might be next on the blame and shame list. It does not build trust. It builds distrust. Leaders seem to expect loyalty from their staff, but they're not willing to give loyalty in return. That is never a good relationship. We talked earlier about layoffs. If you're laying off somebody, you're not being loyal. Period. I'm just not, I don't have a lot of latitude on that one. Over-standardization of work with professionals is never a good thing. Yes, we need standardization in order to be able to measure quality and productivity. But once we have a reasonable amount of standardization, we must not micromanage our professionals. Micromanaging them tells them that you don't trust them.
Right.
It also sends a message that you know more than they do, and that's unlikely. They probably know a hell of a lot more than you know. Bullying and manipulation happens in just about every organization I've worked with, and it's wrong. It's disrespectful, it's counterproductive, and it damages relationships, sometimes irrevocably. Whether it's happening from the leadership or among the staff themselves, it has to be eliminated. And I had a partner at one point in my career, he said, every now and then you have to have a good hanging. This is where I would do that. When you have a bully in the organization, every now and then you got to make an example of that bully. So these are some of the big mistakes that leaders make, and it undermines their very leadership. It undermines their ability to accomplish what they're there to accomplish. And that's the creation of a community that wants to get the work of the organization done. 5 promises. And they're easy. They're fairly straightforward. Easy for me to say. I will tell you that they're very difficult for leaders to keep. And keeping promises is absolutely necessary if you want to be seen as authentic. Promise number 1, I will listen to you with respect and take your input seriously. If we disagree, I'll tell you why. That's a big promise. It goes right back to what I was saying earlier about leaders listening and needing to listen for meaning, not just to respond. Second promise, I will help you learn and grow as you practice your professional work. People come with energy. They came to the job wanting to do something. It was more than a paycheck, especially in the professional arenas that I've been working on. Teachers, nurses, and so on. They will work their tails off for somebody who wants to help them learn and grow. 3, I will help you be wildly successful.
I like
People want to know that their leadership has their back and is trying to help them be successful beyond their wildest dreams. Why wouldn't we promise that? Why wouldn't we help people be successful at the work we've hired them to do? Promise number 4, I'll make sure that you're compensated competitively. That's tricky. Because a lot of compensation, especially among professionals, is benchmarked on salary surveys and wage studies and all of these things. And so HR gets the studies, gives it to management. Management says, well, let's be at the 50% comp ratio and we'll be competitive. And my answer to that is no, you won't.
Yep. Because
the data is already a year old. The competitive dynamics are volatile. And if you're not at the 65th comp ratio, you're not going to be competitive.
Yep.
And that is a very tough sell to some executives. But you're not going to have the best talent unless people feel like they're compensated well.
Yep.
Last promise, I will have your back when things go south. That's not if, that's when.
Man.
Things are going to go wrong. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to fail to meet goals. Lots of things are going to happen that we don't anticipate. And we have to make sure that people understand that we're not treating that as failure. We're treating that as learning. Mm-hmm. And we have their backs. We're going to help them with that. If you make those promises consistently over time and keep them, you're going to create a culture in which people trust one another, help one another, come to work doing the things they want to do because they want to do them. And it will feed the intentions of the entire enterprise. And that's where the soul of the work comes from.
Perfect.
Right there.
Yep.
To address all of that, leaders have to go do two things. They have to go and see. They have to go get out of the offices, nail your damn door shut, go out of the offices, and go find out what's going on in your enterprise. Spend time in the units. Then come back and figure out if there are some things you can act on to help people do their work without obstacles in their way. An example of that, I had a bunch of nurses in one of my unit visits complaining that they weren't able to get the breaks they wanted to get, and they had no vending machine up in their workroom, and they weren't able to do some of the things they wanted to do to just nurture themselves. The next day, I had vending machines installed in their workroom. Period. Simple. Didn't cost me a dime because the vendors provided the machines. And the staff were elated. They were ecstatic. Somebody heard what they had to say.
Somebody heard. Yeah.
They were heard. I listened to them with respect and responded to what they needed. That was a small thing. That didn't require anything more on my part than a freaking phone call.
Yeah.
But it got the thing done, and it created a relationship. Those people knew who I was.
I love that. That's a great story, too. It doesn't cost... People, it doesn't cost much to make a difference in people's experience of being at work. And, I'm talking about being at work, not doing at work.
You got it. So the two things are go and see, go and do.
Go and see, go and do. Go see, yeah. See, do, see, do, see, do. And then it moves into doobie, doobie, do.
Well, we can do that.
Okay, Roger, where can people find out more about what you're up to? The book, Lead with Purpose, Reignite Passion and Engagement for Professionals, I'm assuming can be accessed
on Amazon. Blogs, some of my photographs. I love taking photography, and you'll see a number of things out on my website, rogergerard.com, and there are links there to Amazon for the books. It's all out there.
Great. Folks have been listening to Roger Gerard, owner of Sloan Gerard Consulting. This has been a fascinating, and I think for me, I'll just speak for myself personally, a very rich and compelling conversation. And I want to thank you for that, Roger. I've greatly appreciated having you as a guest. I'd love to have you back at some point in time.
Yeah, anytime. We would love to talk again.
Okay, great. Folks, thank you for listening to this episode of The Soul of Business with Blaine Bartlett. And as always, my admonition at the end of the show is to go out and find a way in your life to be a center of distribution, not a center of accumulation. Nature doesn't work through accumulation. Nature works through distribution, and we are all part of a large natural system. So we need to honor that. I'll see you on the next episode. Take care.